Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and dear audience. On behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada, I welcome all of you to the 11th episode of the webinar series that we ran from May of this year. Our core theme is to explore impacts of COVID-19 onto the socio-political and economic lives of Canadians in general, and in particular, people those who are marginalized uh, and out of focus in many of the societies. Just to start the session, as a part of our tradition, let us acknowledge that Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So, dear audience, we are extremely delighted to introduce you Professor Dr. Cynthia McKinney, and she has a wonderful bio that I'm going to read out very shortly. But before that, my humble interaction with her happened in April last year when I was visiting North South University and was privileged to have a brief discussion with the faculty members of the university. And Professor Dr. Cynthia was there in the audience, and we had a lot of interactions with regards to Rohingya conflict that I was delivering. So thereon, I kind of following her works, and that came to the fruition today, and I'm very happy to have her with us. And without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today. So, Professor Dr. Cynthia is teaching at North South University in Bangladesh, and she had her PhD in leadership and change from Antioch University, Ohio, USA. And after serving in the Georgia Legislature in 1992, McKinney was won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, and she was the first African American woman from Georgia in the U.S. Congress, and that is why she is very unique today. She was the first member of Congress to demand an investigation of the events of 9/11. McKinney was criticized, and as a result, she was defeated in 2002. However, she ran again and was re elected in 2004. In 2005, McKinney was a vocal critique of the government's response to the Hurricane Katrina. And Cynthia introduced legislation to release documents related to the murders of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Tupac Shakur. She was the first member of Congress also to file articles of impeachment against George W. Bush, and she voted against every war funding bill put before her. In 2008, Cynthia McKinney won the Green Party nomination and ran for US President. So, dear audience, you have seen she is not only an educator and scholar, she also has a long track of activism. And these activism actually were directed for global peace and harmony. And that is why we were doubly proud today to introduce her and invite her to share with us her latest book, which she wrote on COVID 19. And you must have seen in the poster. And also, she is very keen and she's keenly following US political developments over the past couple of years. And she was very kind enough to share with her insights about the upheavals or whatever you may term the situation in the South happening. So, as I said, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Dr. Cynthia McKinney here. Floor is yours, ma'am.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this virtual webinar. So, I guess I'll start with the book. And the idea for the book actually came about because, well, you know, the drums of war have been beating against China for a very long time. And with you being there in Canada, you know very well that when Washington, D.C. beats the war drum, Canada responds, Canada answers, unfortunately. So, so what there was all of this information, propaganda, disinformation, misinformation about the situation of Muslims inside China. And so basically, what I decided to do was to put a delegation of like minded people who were willing to go and investigate for themselves rather than believe the propaganda. And so I got 18 people who were willing to finance themselves to go to China on a fact finding, truth finding mission. So we had 18 from the US and we had 2 participants from the UK, a total delegation of 20 people who went to China in order to understand what the reality was about being Muslim in China. That is another book altogether that I would love to write. But so basically, we started in Beijing, and from Beijing, we went to Xi'an. From Xi'an, we went to Dunhuang. And from Dunhuang, we went to Xinjiang. And we tried to um, interact with the local Muslim communities in each one of the towns or cities that we visited. And as it turns out, it wasn't very difficult for us to do that. And what we found was a community that, quite frankly, was a community, and they were happy. They were in business. They were business owners. We did not see concentration camps. We did not see the kinds of propagandistic things that we have been told in the US. But that is also a story for another time. Well, we departed the US and the UK the day after Christmas. So that would be December 26th. And we arrived in China on December 27th. We were in China from December 27th through January 10th was the last date of our of a member of our delegation departing China. So as it turns out, we were right there in the midst of all of this that was happening. We had no idea. We had no clue. We did not visit Hubei province. We did not visit Wuhan. And we looked at the news every night, but that was not a part of our experience when we were there. So as you might remember, the lockdowns began January 20th. So we had been out about 10 days. And after that, I mean, it was like the whole world fell apart. And so our intention was to write one book about our experiences there and what our findings were. But it turned out that it was much more imperative, in my mind, to write another book. And that would be about coronavirus 2, SARS coronavirus 2, and COVID-19. So let me see if I can. Sharing a screen is always quite dangerous. So let me get to, okay, and then let me see if I can share my screen. Yeah, they're telling me it's easier if you have 2 monitors. Well, unfortunately, I don't have 2. So
If you send me, then I can put it up from here as well.
There we go. Okay, so this is the book that's forthcoming. And as you can see, the title of the book is When China Sneezes, which was an idea that came from the publisher, from the coronavirus lockdown to the global politico-economic crisis. So basically, what we start with is what exactly is SARS coronavirus 2? So it's very basic. What is a coronavirus? And what are the political as well as the economic implications of this virus? Now, let me get out of this. How can I do that? Let me see. How can I no. Hmm. So now how do I get out of,
I have already took it out. Yeah.
oh, great. Okay. So, let's see, stop screen. So we took it out. Okay. And so basically what this book does is it starts from the very beginning, and we discuss just exactly what the state of coronavirus research is. And then there's a section in the middle where we discuss the lockdown, because at the very beginning of this, the whole story was about the lockdown and the lockdowns. And there was one lockdown in the beginning, and that was in China. But then, of course, it became a rolling lockdown. So we've got what was China's response to the virus, the what was it like to live through the Wuhan lockdown. Then I have some testimonials from citizens, Chinese citizens, an African citizen who lives in China, a Chinese citizen who's willing to go on the record and talk about what it was like to experience that kind of a lockdown. And then a non-Chinese resident who was trying to get into China but couldn't get into China, even though she lived in China but was not a Chinese citizen. So that whole lockdown experience. And we've got the testimony of the African who originally is from Nigeria, whose parents sent her to China in order to learn the Chinese language, because, of course, you know, China is all over Africa these days. And so she retells the story of her real horror of having to go to a hospital in China where she's the only one who has melanated skin. And so the doctors and the nurses have to figure out where her veins are. I mean, she, you know, it's just even something as simple as that. So anyway, that those stories are what take us through part 2. Then in part 3, we talk about the economic impact. And there I've got some internationally renowned economists who agreed to write chapters for us. And of course, I was thrilled to get a chapter from Michael Hudson. And in addition to Michael Hudson, we have Jack Rasmus talking about the U.S. situation. Michael Hudson talks about the global situation. And Peter Koenig talks about China. And William Robinson, a professor in California, talks about the global situation as well. And then finally, we get to part 4, which is a discussion of hybrid warfare. And of course, that is very interesting and exciting to me. I wrote the chapter about genocide. So we have an offering from Whitney Webb. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she is an investigative journalist. She's based in Chile, but she has done a fabulous job of cutting through. She's got a book coming out actually about the whole Jeffrey Epstein situation, that whole scenario. And I wrote the chapter on genocide. answering the question, is it possible for a virus to be designed that would target one specific subpopulation? And the answer to that question is yes, it is possible. Then we have an offering from Italy. Claudio Peretti talked about the economic aspect of biowarfare. And then we've got Gary Barnett talking about just the dysfunctionality and the inconceivability of biowarfare, but because it comes back on those who unleash it, as we might have witnessed right now with the situation with COVID-19. And then finally, we have a chapter from a journalist who writes for Russia Today. And basically, what they do is frame the objective of why is this happening now? And why is this a goal that results in the total destruction of our way of life as we know it now? So we've got that. And then finally, we've got the commentary from Alfred de Zayas about the need for a new social contract. And so that is basically what the book contains. And I think some of the conclusions that we arrive at as a result of the research are shocking and, quite frankly, quite sad. But it's a reality that we are having to deal with.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. So, before I think you're going to switch to the second part, can we just have more insights from your book? For example, if you share some of your insights about the idea of hybrid warfare or bio warfare that you just mentioned, and how do you really connect China and the rest of the world? Because we are already aware in media there are discussions, especially from the states, that this is a targeted kind of activities done by a group of people. And so, how do you see these whole things, and how did you reflect it in your chapter?
Well, I guess I would start with hybrid warfare is something that I've been interested in for a long time. And I started out with an interest in targeted assassination. And that was my interest because I lived targeted assassinations as a young adult in the United States in the growing coming of age in the civil rights movement. And so when we had an entire decade of activists in the 1960s, starting 1963 with JFK being assassinated in broad open daylight on the streets of the US. But then in 1969, we had activists like me who were targeted by the state and who were murdered, like, for example, Fred Hampton, who was the leader of the Chicago Black Panther Party. So this idea of the state being responsible for murders, and those murders then making a difference in terms of public policy, is something that I have studied, and I studied as a fact with my dissertation, writing about the U.S. war against the American Indian movement, AIM, the American Indian movement, the Black Panthers, the Black Panther Party members. And that's a part of the COINTELPRO program. I don't know the extent to which you all are familiar with the counterintelligence program. It was run by the FBI, and basically the objective was to, quote unquote, neutralize leadership of all persuasions that were not amenable to the wishes and dictates of the deep state. So you have that going on. And so what you witness, according to Senator Frank Church, who investigated all of the COINTELPRO, the exaggerated violent reactions, was that what the United States, the behaviors that the United States carried out abroad, eventually were turned back inside. And so you can see that, for example, in the chapter I talk about the virus is in the safe. So basically what the United States did was it prepared a virus in order to kill Patrice Lumumba. Now, why did the United States want Patrice Lumumba killed? Well, they wanted him killed because, according to the State Department cables, he was an effective leader for the Congolese people. It took nothing more than that for the United States to want to kill him. And so a virus was prepared. It was placed in the safe at the U.S. Embassy in Congo. And then the cable went from Washington, D.C. to, at that time, I think it was Lubumbashi, saying that the virus is in the safe. Now, this was a targeted assassination that was authorized at the highest levels of the United States government. President Eisenhower himself authorized the murder of Patrice Lumumba. It was the first time that a head of state or a head of government had been specifically authorized with a set of money, $100,000 was set aside to accomplish the murder. Now, what we learned from the Frank Church Committee hearings is that the targeted assassinations, the what now we call the color revolutions, all of those things were a part of the toolbox that the United States had in order to make sure that policies emanating from other parts of the world were favorable to certain interests inside the United States. It didn't take a long time for those behaviors then to come back home to the US. And so with at World War II, the United States took over the Japanese biological warfare unit, and they were given asylum. They were shielded from prosecution, and their findings, their scientific papers, came to the United States. And the United States figured that this was a treasure trove. It was too good to turn down. The United States then, the US government then began to test these biological agents on the people of the United States. So not only did they carry out heinous acts overseas, but they also began to carry out heinous acts at home. And that is really the story of biological warfare, hybrid warfare, eventually having come home. And then, of course, what we see happening on the streets in the United States today, the equivalent of a color revolution. I've written a paper called Purple Revolution, where I talk about those very people who carried out color revolutions on behalf of the United States government and for their own personal pecuniary interests as well, now are involved in domestic U.S. politics. And that is what we're seeing on the streets of the U.S. today. So we really have come full circle. And what it turns out is that SARS coronavirus 2 being the virus and COVID-19 being the disease that's caused by the virus also is not just a biological agent. It's not just a biological happenstance, but this is something that was crafted in a laboratory. And of course, we know now that Dr. Fauci was part and parcel. We can go back to the studies and we can see where there was gain-of-function studies that were carried out to increase the susceptibility of humans to the invasion of SARS. Well, at that time, it wasn't SARS coronavirus 2 because it didn't have a name, but of this experimental virus that they were looking at in Australia. What they did, it was no accident that the Indian scientists found the 4 areas on the virus that were HIV-like proteins, because that study was carried out, that experimentation was carried out in Australia. And then the gain of function to make sure that the proteins in the human body that this virus would attach to easily. Well, that study, that's called gain of function, and that study was carried out at the University of North Carolina. And then when the United States said, oh, this is unethical scientific endeavor, we're not going to do this any longer, then Dr. Fauci paid the Chinese to continue the study. And so we know that we have an agent that was engineered so that it could infect humans. Now, what the Chinese were wondering from SARS was, well, why is it just us? Why is it just East Asians are affected by SARS? Now, and the interesting thing about SARS was that East Asians were affected whether they were in Asia or they were in North America. They, as you can remember from Canada, the Canadian East Asians were affected by SARS. Okay, so then the Chinese continued these studies. They studied MERS. They said that they were going to study Ebola. They said that they were going to study, the purpose of their level 4 biolab was that they wanted to study Ebola and HIV. Well, now, if it turns out that Ebola and HIV are also engineered products of Fort Detrick, well, do you think that the United States wants the Chinese mucking around over into that? Well, I don't think they do. And so this is a way, what has transpired, I shouldn't jump around. So let me finish this because it's really interesting. So basically what the Chinese, they're studying, okay, SARS is only affecting us. MERS is only affecting people from West Asia, North Africa. H1N1 basically affected mostly people in the Americas, in South America, in fact. So what's going on here? Is there some underlying something that we can't quite put our hands on? So basically, they kept studying, the Chinese kept studying, and kept studying until one group, I believe in Shanghai, discovered that the particular protein that SARS coronavirus 2 uses to attach to human cells is called the ACE2 protein. Well, that was not enough. That's a big finding, but it wasn't enough. That was like the first shoe dropping. But the second shoe dropped when they only had a small study, a small population from which to conduct the study. But what they found, the Chinese found, was that East Asians have a whole lot of ACE2 in their system. And South Asians have a bit of ACE2 in their systems. Africans have a bit of ACE2 in their systems. But guess who has very little ACE2? Europeans. So, therein, if you look at what happened in Italy, what happened in Italy was comorbidity. So, of course, I have like family in Italy. My son went to high school in Italy, so and members of my family are in the medical profession. So I contacted them. Well, you know, it's extended family, but I'm an honorary Italian, okay? And so they confirmed that the average age of death was plus 83. And so it was not just elderly people, but these were also people who were sick. Now, something about the vaccine. Other coronaviruses, like SARS and MERS, there were efforts to get vaccines for these coronavirus cases. And basically what happened was, upon reinfection, something terrible happened and the patients were lost. So, and that's exactly the scenario of a vaccination. So you take the vaccination and what does it do? It's like a reinfection. And that's why all of this talk about vaccines is like, you know, it's like hocus pocus up in the sky, because there hasn't been a successful vaccine developed. Upon reinfection, you get all of these other things that eventually end up in death. So, but the Italians had flu shot, which is like a reinfection. And so you had all of these things that were working together, and they increased the morbidity of SARS coronavirus 2 on the Italian population. And that's what was happening. And even if you look at the initial stages in the United States, what happened was that you were talking about people over the age of 80 who also had these comorbidities. And so I'm talking about in among the European American population. Now, you've had tremendous deaths take place within the African American community in the United States, and that fits with what the Chinese found in terms of their expectation of who would be affected by SARS coronavirus 2. So that information leads me to an affirmative response to, is it possible to craft a virus that affects only certain populations? And in fact, the United States was illegally collecting DNA from the Chinese, and they were also illegally collecting DNA from the Russians. So much so that both the Chinese government and the Russian government lodged a complaint. So we have this kind of circumstantial evidence that SARS coronavirus 2 is something that's crafted in a laboratory. So what I do in the chapter is I go to motive, because of course, you know, you can't just say that this is something that would happen. It doesn't really make sense unless you can trace a motive to the behavior. Well, there's means, motive, and opportunity, right? And that equals threat. So the motive goes back to the very founding of the United States. If you look at the very ethos of the United States, of the being of the United States, you have these gentlemen sitting around a table talking about freedom and happiness, and yet they have slaves. And they discuss about expanding, growing the country from shore to shore, and it's somebody else's land, as the Supreme Court just recently affirmed that 90% of the state of Oklahoma belongs to the indigenous Native Americans, the Native people. So, so these founding fathers of the United States were willing to steal the land and kill in order to get the land. And they were willing to steal the labor, and they were willing to kill in order to keep that as a way of life. Of course, that's what I'm talking about. The Civil War of the United States was all about that. So we've got the birth of a nation, as it were, that is dripping in the blood of non-European peoples. And so somewhere there was this idea that was firmly implanted in the US about racial superiority and the ability to create a racially superior human being through the certain practices. Well, one of those practices was eugenics. And so I discuss how eugenics, according to Edwin Black, the very notion of eugenics starts in the United States and then goes around the rest of the world. And so you've got this theory about how to improve humanity, and then that theory finds resonance inside the circles in the US that have access to resources and power. And so university professors begin to write about this idea, and politicians begin to talk about this idea. Their campaign coffers are full. And then as the universities, professors are writing about this and getting their articles placed in international journals, then the idea spreads. Well, of course, this goes to reaffirm the whole colonial structure of the international system. So this all fit in very well. And after World War II, the United States was poised to assume international leadership of this European class, what James Wolfenson calls the 80-20 rule, that basically 1 billion people who constitute the Europeans in Europe and in the diaspora have control over 80% of global GDP, and that is to be expected. That is the way of life. And he goes on to say that international organs were created with that purpose in mind, to maintain the power structure that had been established as a result of colonialism. Okay, so we got the proliferation of this theory about eugenics, and guess where it lands? According to Edwin Black, it lands in Nazi Germany. It carries it out to the extreme. So it's very interesting, the history that Black is able to trace, that Nazi Germany didn't start in Germany, it started in the US. And then, of course, there's the document written by the Project for a New American Century, which is a group of individuals who go in and out of the US government. And basically, on page 60 of Rebuilding America's Defenses, they write that a genotypically specific, this isn't exactly what they say, but it's like this, that a biological weapon that can target particular genotypes becomes a politically useful tool. So there you have your motive. There you have your motive. So now we've gone from what is theoretically possible to the entire ethos around the founding of a country, to the way that country behaves in the international arena, the way that country interacts with other countries. And then we have people who are willing to use the power of that country to further their own interests. And they specifically write about the use of biological warfare as a part of a hybrid war that's being waged against the rest of the world. So would the United States do that? Absolutely yes. Did the United States have the capacity to create such a biological weapon? Absolutely yes. And they've done it over and over and over again. And I give instances that were discovered by the Frank Church Committee that investigated the excesses, the crimes that were committed by U.S. intelligence against other countries, trying to kill heads of state, dropping anthrax in Cuba. That was one of the things that was done. Various things, and you can look at things that are happening in China right now and ask a question. The United States has used biological weapons in the past against Korea and China. We have that from a study that was done at the time by some UK scientists who went out and investigated. They went into the field and they investigated allegations against the US, which the US basically denied until this study was unearthed a few years ago. So we've got the means, we've got the motive, we've got the opportunity. Do we have the deed? That's the question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cynthia. It was quite fascinating way, and we were kind of not aware of all the details that you mentioned. Fascinating. We look forward for the book to be released, and definitely we'll have more insights from there. Dear audience, we are joined by Dr. Hilal Mahiuddin from Bangladesh, and he is also a director of research and communication with Conflict and Resilience Research Institute. Let's welcome him. And Dr. Hilal, if you have any question on the aspects Dr. Cynthia just shared with us and discussed, if you have, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kausar and Dr. Cynthia. Dr. Cynthia, especially, you deserve a big applause. Excellent presentation. I was just listening, uh, just without thinking about anything else. I was 100% focused to your presentation and your arguments. So it's a very interesting, and there are something that I have a number of questions actually. All these things are curiosity. Out of your presentation and my understanding, I just need to know one or two of them, not all. So the first one is your perspective, your findings, and your revelation that you have gotten in China. It sounds, it would sound to many readers, I am pretty sure, one-sided, kind of one-sided. I am curious to know if you have had any opportunity to check it or just filter some of the information out or to cross-check, cross-verify with other arguments that people are looking at differently, especially about China and Chinese minorities, the minorities that you are mentioning about Muslims and Uyghurs. These information are coming out these days, and there is a strong group of people who really religiously believe in these, whatever you say, whether it is propaganda or information war or whatever. So this is one part. I just wanted to know how are you making a good balance between your findings, your revelation, and what other people are saying, because we need to have really two perspectives, and that's one thing. And the
Mhm.
second one is about the timeline. When did the United States of America begin its biological warfare development, in the 60s or before that or in the 40s? Not in the 40s because it was in the war at that time. So maybe from the 50s. And 60s was the most turbulent time in history because of different types of movement. At the same time, the young folks, new ideas and new subcultures. So 60s was the most turbulent time in many respects, and it has changed changed the world actually. The cultural revolution took place there in a different way, and it shook the whole world. And the 60s is especially our focus. So I am curious to know if you have any concrete information when the United States really start to think about or plan or develop different types of alternative warfares, especially biological warfare, biological weapons, not warfare, biological weapons and other weapons in the form of uh, like SARS, MERS, and other. So that's
Well,
it. That's pretty much it. Yeah.
the United States has thought about biological weapons for a very long time, since the beginning of the United States, since the 13 colonies and the effort to go westward. So this is not, biological warfare is not anything new. And in fact, I do devote some time to the use of insects, because at one point the United States was interested in using insects in warfare, and the United States isn't the first. I think back in the Roman Empire, they were using insects. So biological warfare is not anything new. What is new is the ability to craft these viruses that are basically invisible. And as one researcher said to me, our bloodstream is now the battlefield. And that, I believe, is what we have to understand, is that um, at one point it was, I think there's something about using bees. They use bees and they use ants and they um, used other insects. The United States even was trying to figure out how they could craft a bomb, build a bomb that was just filled with different insects. And so they were practicing this, studying this, but they really got the treasure trove of information from the Japanese, because the Japanese had actually um, introduced these kinds of new biological agents and used them in a new kind of way. And the Japanese took extensive notes. So when it was clear that the United States was going to win World War II, then the United States began to get the scientists from the Japanese unit, shielded them from prosecution, arranged asylum for them, and of course, the only price they had to pay was to turn over their findings, their studies, and that's exactly what happened. So that's when this all sort of started in earnest. And then with the Korean War, um, it was used, the United States used these biological agents, anthrax, plague. Um, the study lists the various agents that were used. They were used against China and they were used against Korea. And so, and this is as documented by a group of UK scientists. So now, in terms of balance, what I would say is that it would, if this were a book about the being Muslim in China, then of course we would have to conduct way more um, uh, um, interviews than we did. We would have to have done a lot more. It would have been a different book. In fact, that book is on the back burner. We were going to do that book. But then when coronavirus happened, that changed the whole emphasis to doing a different book. And so the the book about the treatment of the Uyghurs is something that, of course, is necessary as well. But the United States, quite frankly, is the last country on the planet that ought to be complaining about the way Muslims are treated. The United States has to its record a record number of Muslim deaths and then trained other Muslims to kill other Muslims on behalf of non-Muslims. In fact, you have Wesley Clark talking about, well, if you want to defeat Hezbollah, you've got to find fanatics, and this is available on the internet. You can go and look up Wesley Clark, and you can find Wesley Clark saying, if you want to defeat Hezbollah, you've got to find fanatics who are willing to fight to the death. Okay, so that's a different book than this coronavirus book. But and you're right that there should be more than just what we found on the ground. But what we found on the ground should not be discounted because we were on the ground.
Thank you so much. Dear audience, let's switch gear here and listen more of insightful data and observations from Dr. Cynthia about what is happening in the U.S. And she already wrote up a journal article, I believe, Doctor, and she titled it "Purple Revolution." So, just I'm trying to set up a context here, and I would like to start by remembering and honoring George Floyd today, and the untimely and a very sad event of his passing away in the hands of police really sparked a global outrage. And especially, Canada is a country where we discuss these things differently than that of US. I can say this much, that the culture of discussion of politics and political violence is a little different here. And especially, I'm from city of Winnipeg, Manitoba, often ignored as a fly-by place. It's just middle of the prairies. But something astonishing happened last month when people congregated in thousands to honor and to remember George Floyd, and
Mm.
to express solidarity with the Black Lives Movement. And it was absolutely peaceful. I was there myself, actually, on that event. So I've seen, not only me, I'm just, I would say, pretty much new Canadian in the context of others, only 10 years old in Canada. But I have met many people, I mean, those who lived all their lives here, and they said and they shared with us that they had never seen such a huge, huge congregation of people. And dear audience, you can always Google search, and if you go to Black Lives Movement protest in Winnipeg, you will see the wave of human beings, you know, lined up in the streets and the legislative building. It was such a spectacle, I would say. So I'm just setting up the context from here and requesting Dr. Cynthia to give us some more insights, because there are two reasons. Professor Dr. Cynthia is a woman of color, as we all know, and she had been to the highest seat of the government in the U.S. before choosing to be an academic. So she will have very unique perspective of her from her point of view. So, dear audience, let's hear what is happening with Purple Revolution. Here you are.
Okay, so I'm going to go back into my share screen again and hope that, oh, application window. Oh, this, do you see it? No, I don't
Uh,
think you do.
no, I not yet. It would pop up here, and I would share it with the audience.
Oh, um, oh, it's telling me I've got to take several steps in order to be able to
Or,
share.
I would suggest if you continue your talkings, and in the meantime send me through the email, I will pop it up from here.
Uh, okay, let me see if I can. Uh, I know.
It worked last time, yeah.
Oh, here we go. Here we go. So let me see if I can do it this way, which is slightly different than what I was trying to do before. Okay. Do you have it?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. So this is on academia.edu, and I asked the question, is U.S. hybrid warfare coming home to roost? If you'll recall, 2016, you had Donald Trump running against Hillary Clinton. And Hillary was like the shoe-in. Everyone expected that Hillary was going to be the next president of the United States. She would be the first woman president of the United States. And it's very interesting that of all the places in the world that champions women's rights, or so-called champions women's rights, it's the United States that has not yet had a woman president. So we all expected that Hillary Clinton was going to win, except I didn't want her to win because she's the wrong kind of woman, in my opinion. And so on her election night, she wore the color purple. Now, why was she wearing purple on election night? She wore purple on election night because that's the blending of red and blue. Red stands for the Republican Party. Blue stands for the Democratic Party. And her victory strategy was to pull enough support from the red states and pull enough support from the blue states so that she could create a purple revolution. That's where the color purple, and you can see that what I've done here is I've taken pictures and all of the Democrats wore the color purple. So it was very clear that the United States was in the midst of a purple revolution, except it didn't turn out that way. And so what we witnessed, and I quote here Sun Tzu, where he says, be extremely subtle, even to the point of formlessness. Be extremely mysterious, even to the point of soundlessness. Thereby, you can be the director of the opponent's fate. That was what was supposed to happen. But something unexpected, totally unexpected happened. And that was that Donald Trump got elected. And so all of those forces, all of that, those personalities, those deep state entities that had assumed that Hillary was going to win had to regroup. And what we have witnessed is, in my opinion, a color revolution carried out against Donald Trump ever since Election Day. Ever since that unexpected election result that took place in November 2016. So basically what I do is I focus on one person who has a lot of experience in orchestrating color revolutions. And he's been banned in some countries because he practices color revolutions. And that is George Soros. George Soros has been involved with U.S. intelligence agencies in carrying out color revolutions in other parts of the world. Well, if you understand, as I said earlier, that practices of the United States overseas eventually come home, then it wouldn't be a surprise that even the practice of a color revolution could actually be brought home to the U.S. And so I go in and I look at what George Soros has done in other parts of the world. I look at the weaponization of migration and the role that George Soros plays there. And eventually I get to George Soros's involvement in U.S. politics, and just to just encapsulate the 2018 Soros contributions, here I list them. That Soros was involved at every level of the electoral process in the United States in the 2018 elections. That is the election that brought a Democratic Party majority to the House of Representatives, to the U.S. House of Representatives. And so this then sets the stage for impeachment. So basically, if you can go here and you can look and you can see the million after million after million after million of dollars that were contributed by George Soros's. These are George Soros's political contributions. So now the question is, would that happen? Would that be done to the United States? Well, the fact is that you've got some long-standing grievances that have not been resolved. And one of the things that I recommend to other political leaders in other countries is that if you have a minority problem, resolve that problem. Include the minorities in the governance structure of your polity so that they are not just sitting there waiting for someone to come up and hand them a lot of money so that they can become a problem. And so the United States has taken care of everybody else's business, but it has not done a very good job of taking care of its own business. And so, therefore, would a situation like a George Floyd be able to kick off and provide an opportunity for those who are interested in destroying the presidency of Donald Trump? Give them the opportunity to do that? Absolutely. Yes, they could do so. And in many respects, that is exactly what has happened. So not for a second would I say that there are that a movement has been hijacked. I wouldn't say that, because I want to give honor to the grievance that has been a long-standing grievance of police brutality. My father was a police officer, and my dad would come home angry that the white police officers, their practice was basically to handcuff black men around telephone poles and beat them with their sticks, with their nightsticks. They would do that, and they could do that without any issue at all, without any punishment or anything. So the idea that there are not legitimate grievances is wrong. There are legitimate grievances, and those grievances have been ignored by the powers that be inside the United States. So now, does that provide an opportunity for entrepreneurial activists to get involved? It absolutely does. And I believe that is what has happened.
Thank you once again, Dr. Cynthia, for your brilliant way of putting these whole things into perspective. Dear audience, let me also again bring Dr. Hilal Mohiuddin, if he is still around. Dr. Hilal, if you want to add something, or if you have any questions, the
Jackson?
floor is yours.
Jackson?
No, it's excellent clarification from Cynthia. I was just listening very carefully, and so it's just marvelous in terms of depth and breadth of information. At the same time, the credibility of information, the way she presented is really fascinating. And I am just expecting that we would be getting more books and more analysis as she's planning, and hoping for the best, that she would get the best information for us on these topics. These topics are really something that interests me, and hopefully we would be getting her new books pretty soon, within this year, next year. All the best wishes for her. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hilal, for your part here, and Dr. Cynthia is with us still, and if she is watching, we'll just take one question, just to be conscious about time, from the audience. And Dr. Cynthia, if you can see, here is the question, and if you kindly, answer, or I mean, have something to say on that. And it is the question is flashed on the screen.
Yes, I see the question. And it's a wonderful question because, ultimately, that that's the world that I want to see. And what I didn't get into was uh, with respect to Dr. Halal's question about balance and the situation with with the Uyghurs. I've taken a look at some of the constitutions, the newer constitutions in the CRRIC region. And basically, so you've got Nepal that has a wonderful new constitution, and they directly attack this issue of prejudice, discrimination, classism, casteism, and at least they put it on paper. And then, of course, I know that they've had some difficulty in living up to the what they've written, but at least they wrote it. They thought about it and they wrote it, and they're trying to carry it out. The same thing goes with the Chinese constitution that takes a direct stab at Han chauvinism, as they call it. And so that also is very, very an important step, because they recognize that there's a problem and that they want to try and deal with that problem. Now, dealing with that problem is a lot more difficult than actually acknowledging the problem. But acknowledging the problem, you can't deal with it if you don't acknowledge it. The United States has never acknowledged that they have a problem. And so the United States has these unresolved issues, and honestly, if other countries wanted to attack the United States, it's the soft underbelly. That's where they can attack the United States. It doesn't have to launch one bomb, not one missile, not land one soldier. Just deal with these unresolved issues. So now, how do we do that? First of all, I believe, how do we deal with Anaf's question? I think, first of all, we have to deal with ourselves. So, I go to Bangladesh, and it's an entirely different paradigm for me. And so the things that I think about and things I've been told not to say, oh, you can't talk about that and blah, 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 blah. Well, it's different in another part of the world with different experiences. And so I had to adjust myself to a new context. And I think we all human beings are moving around from place to place. We need to adjust ourselves to a different context, to new contexts. And so I think a lot of introspection is what's needed. And there are specific steps that you can take in order to induce a positivity, a positive attitude toward change. And self-change is one of those things. So that's one thing. But here's another thing. Why was it that eugenics was able to catch on in the United States so easily? And why is it that the United States' first resort when dealing with other peoples is bombs, missiles, soldiers, war, death, and destruction? And I think it's because there is an underlying issue that is unaddressed. And that underlying issue is, I believe, well, one, it stems from what Dr. Frances Cress Welsing talked about when she investigated why Europeans have such animus against non-European peoples. And basically what she discussed was the fear of genetic annihilation. Imagine if you are traveling around the world and you have your red hair and your blue eyes, and what you discover is that there's no place else on the planet that has red hair and blue eyes. You imagine that you are unique. You discover that you are unique. But imagine, as James Wolfenson talked about the 80-20 rule, imagine that you're not having babies. your population in real terms is actually declining. And so this edifice, this superstructure that you have been able to build is about to crumble under the fact that the population imbalance. And so this fear of genetic annihilation, you've got European descendant people now who are literally talking about they're going to wipe us out. People of color are going to wipe us out. And so now where is the world for people who are of European descent? Do we make room for them when they don't do what's necessary in order to reproduce? That's one thing. But then the other thing, so you've got that fear, but then you've got another much more fundamental fear, which I believe goes something like this, which is what I've heard in the United States over and over and over again. Are these people of color going to treat us the way we have treated them? So now you've got, not only are you in a position of being a permanent minority, but you might actually be on the receiving end of that which you have crafted and dished out for centuries. That would make me afraid too. And I would start trying to make peace as profoundly as possible. And I believe you have some European descendants who are actually trying to do that. And then you have some who are on the other end of the spectrum who are going to fight to the last person. And I think that's where we are.
Absolutely, absolutely. But just to be conscious, again, the time left for the session. But I just wanted to take the last question from the audience, and he's one of our practicum students. He's doing his master's degree in peace and conflict studies at the University of Manitoba, and his name is Kwazo, and this is what he has to say. And we would request Dr. Cynthia to comment on that, whether we can get rid of all these so-called United Nations
Yes.
and others. What do you think?
Well, clearly that's what James Wolfenson was talking about. He was specifically talking about the United Nations, the IMF, and the World Bank. You can find his speech. You can go to my YouTube site where I took out just an excerpt, Run, Cynthia, Run, on YouTube. But if you want the speech in totality, it's before Stanford University MBA students, James Wolfenson. And there's about 3 minutes where he specifically mentions this very important shift that's about to take place. And he also says that the 80-20 world within which he grew up will become a 65-35 world, a 35-65 world, where that formerly colonized world will have 65% of global GDP. So there's a massive restructuring that's taking place right now. And so those who used to be on top have got to figure out mentally how to cope with a new scenario. And so now in terms of a total boycott, well, by African countries, I would say that you've got a parallel structure that is being built right now. And that parallel structure would consist of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You've got New Development Bank there with BRICS. You've got there were certain leaders who were building a parallel alternative structure. Gaddafi was trying to do, well, actually, from my dissertation, what I learned is that Muammar Gaddafi and Hugo Chavez were working together. And what they created was the Africa-South America Summit. Basically, they said that we are one people. And so therefore, they began to integrate. Their goal was to integrate economically, culturally, socially, and militarily. That was their goal. And so Gaddafi was to use the oil wealth from Libya to sort of be like the godfather around African unity. And Chavez was going to do the same with South America. Chavez is gone. Gaddafi is gone. Kirchner in Argentina is gone. Dilma Rousseff is gone. Rene Preval, who was like sort of the Caribbean linchpin, gone. And so something happened. I believe this, we saw targeted assassination of high value targets. And these high value targets, they were gotten rid of because the US experience is if you eliminate the head of an organization, then you can pretty much decimate the organization and the movement that is a part and parcel of that organization. And so now what the United States, the security apparatus of the United States is looking at is if you have an ideology, say, for example, you have a religious belief, you have Islam. And so there's not just one person that you can decapitate and then decapitate the movement, because there's someone who will come in and take that leader's place. So now you've got to have a multi-pronged attack against the very essence and beliefs of this belief system, a network. And so that's how you've got now network analysis in trying to eliminate these organizations, these movements. And that's how you end up with the rise of ISIS, so that ISIS and Daesh and Boko Haram and all of the rest of them, so they can fight other Muslims and do the job that there's not enough Europeans, or Europeans don't have the will, or whatever, that this group of outsiders cannot accomplish. But yes, the imperative is to create alternative structures that allow you to breathe. Because right now, Africa is George Floyd. Africa cannot breathe.
Absolutely. Thank you. Fascinating. Dear audience, we are at the very end of this session. And traditionally, we ask and request the speakers to have their last words. So today we have, because one speaker, and I think our audience, they have enjoyed much from your research findings and insights. So, Dr. Cynthia, if you have your last words, then I will sum up the session
Okay.
and finish it. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, I think ultimately we all want a world in which everyone is allowed to breathe. And the sad fact is that a very ugly side of the United States has been shown to the world. It's not the first time, it's just a reminder. So can we as US citizens rise above our past? I believe we can. And can we as citizens of the world rise above an oppressive past and present? And I believe we can. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., on the night before he was killed, he was murdered, said that he was very happy to be living at that particular time, because the world was sort of opening up toward revolution. And I see some profound changes taking place. The question is, whose revolution are we about to um, embark upon? Will it be the people's revolution, or will it be more of entrenchment of the powers that don't need to be? Let's hope that it's the people's revolution this time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cynthia. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our today's session, and in order to sum up, I just reflect upon the research findings and the insights that Dr. Cynthia shared today with us, and she spoke about her upcoming, would be released book, and and a team of 20 others actually were there in China, it's an interesting time because they were just at that point in time when the virus was actually was spreading out. But they came back early of the infection period, and they have shared their findings in their book. So, dear audience, please have a look in their book, and definitely, as you have heard today from Dr. Cynthia, you will have very different ideas about what is happening all around the world, and especially in the United States. And she spoke about the hybrid warfare, and I would also like to remind our audience to also check out the works of Elvin and Heidi Toffler, and one of their prime books, if I remember, Shockwave. They spoke about those possibilities, opportunities of microorganisms as vectors carrying, all these things. And as Dr. Cynthia rightly mentioned, do you have the motive? Do you have the capacity and opportunity? So, if you combine all these three facets together, then, audience, please draw your own conclusion. But I think this discussion was very timely, and that is why we are very fortunate and grateful Dr. Cynthia's deliberation today. And also, she spoke about the Purple Revolution and how the current upheaval in the United States is possibly going to lay a different world in the future. And it was very interesting that she used, I would say, quite nicely the word that Africa can't breathe. And if you want to take it as a metaphor, dear audience, you can. But I think it's an interesting metaphor because as minorities all over the world, in the West or East, wherever you are living, this is particularly the way that we express our situation where we can't, or we are unable to breathe, and the breathing is possibly the fundamental human rights that we all acknowledge. Nonetheless, she finished her discussion with a very optimistic note that yes, we all are bound together with the same fate in this earth, and our shared future would possibly the only way that we would move forward in the future. So, dear audience, let's thank Dr. Cynthia for taking all the trouble because she is going to travel after she finishes with us now. We need to leave her, but we just wanted to express our gratitude from Winnipeg, Canada. And Dr. Hilal is also with us from Bangladesh. And he also joins in thanking Dr. Cynthia, and also, dear audience, thank you very much for being with us for last 1.5 hours and all the brilliant questions that you put forward. Thank you so much, and stay fine wherever you go, and travel safe. And we'll definitely meet each other down the path of peace and justice. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, and have a good day. Have a good
Thank
day,
you.
Cynthia.
You have a good
Thanks.
day too, because it's you stayed up all night.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was kind of sleepy, but no, you're